Hi everyone. Today I wanted to talk about something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I've seen happening in almost every long-lived system I've interacted with, and it's a tendency that we have to keep patching things instead of stepping back and rethinking them. I don't mean that in a critical way, because honestly, most of the time patching is completely understandable and reasonable. When a system is first built, it usually has a pretty clear scope. There's a goal, there are constraints, the architecture does reflect that moment in time. So it makes sense for us trying to solve. But when reality starts shifting, um, requirements evolve, stakeholders change their minds, edge cases appear that nobody predicted, and sometimes funding and deadlines start putting pressure on delivery. And in those moments, instead of asking whether the original structure still fits the current reality, what we often do is adding something small like a workaround, conditions, extra layers to make things more flexible. And each one of those on their own are completely reasonable. And from a technical perspective, it makes sense, right? Redesigning something fundamental feels risky. Testing obviously is also never exhaustive. So no matter how good the coverage is, there are always interactions you didn't anticipate. So touching the core system always feels dangerous. So in a patch feels safer. It touches, of course, fewer components. It lets you move forward without destabilizing anything. But there's also the organizational layer to that, which I think is just as important. Most teams operate under deadlines, under budgets, under expectations to deliver something reasonable. A structural rethink might be a healthier long-term decision, but it doesn't always produce immediate output, right? It doesn't look like progress in the short term either. So patching those things, becomes rational choice, not because people don't care about quality, but it's more about the environment rewarding speed and predictability. But then something subtle happens in time. The system starts accumulating layers, and each patch that makes sense locally, then it starts distancing itself, and globally the structure becomes harder to reason about. So complexity, in a sense, start growing quietly. And the more complex the system becomes, the scarier it does feel to redesign. So the complexity created by patching makes future patching even more likely, which then on its own becomes a feedback loop. And what makes this even more interesting is how abstraction plays into it. As abstraction grows, systems become easier to use and to align around. It does help us to create some form of consensus. It does reduce friction as well. It allows more people to build, to collaborate, to show up, and to ship. And that's powerful in its progress. But, at the same time, abstraction doesn't erase underlying details. It doesn't eliminate shifting assumptions. It doesn't remove long-term responsibility. So it simply moves those details further away from day-to-day visibility. While abstraction makes coordination easier in the short term, the structural shifts underneath still accumulate. If those shifts aren't periodically examined, then the gap between what the system looks like and what it actually begins what it actually is begins to widen. And that's where fragility starts to emerge, not because anyone was careless, but because the original design, um, not because the original design was wrong, but because reflection didn't scale at the same rate as complexity. So I don't think the answer is to never patch. Obviously, that's unrealistic. Incremental change is part of engineering. Stability matters, shipping matters, but long-lived systems need moments where we take a step back and we ask whether the assumption we're building on are still valid. Because complexity isn't just a technical artifact; it's often a reflection of the environment the system was built on. And abstraction, while incredibly useful, doesn't absolve us of responsibility over time. It just changes where essentially where that responsibility lives. So I hope that you've learned something interesting and new today. And I thank you for listening as well. Take care.